So I want to welcome everybody to Ask the Expert. A Third Party Risk Institute provides an Ask the Expert live stream session once a month. And during that time, we have people like my esteemed colleague, Tom Garrubba, to come and have a conversation with us about third-party risk around a specific topic. So the session will be recorded. We welcome you to put your mic on mute. You can either, if you have a question, want to make a comment, etc. That's part of what learning is. This is all about peer sharing and networking and having some access to expertise. So just put your hand up in the chat, or in fact, you can put your hand up and actually ask the question live if you wish, and you can make yourself known or not known. If you're in the chat, basically, I'll just use your first name, unless you tell me it's okay to say who you are. So anyhow, so today we're going to talk about future-proofing third-party risk management. And it's an interesting subject because certainly I know I would say more than 50% of people on today's Ask the Expert are actually from outside of North America, which is probably the first time we've had such a large international audience. And I would thank you for that, Tom. I'm sure you've had a lot of influence in that happening. So we have a good group today. And but what we're seeing basically is that third-party risk management is catching on worldwide in every industry sector. And we're all trying to madly learn from one another. So North American financial services were really on top of this pretty early. And I would say very close followers would be Singapore MAS and the regulators in the UK, right? But everything is charging for super, super fast. And so I'm very fortunate to have a guest today, Tom Garrubba, who I'll ask you to introduce yourself, Tom. And Tom and I have known each other for quite a number of years, and our paths keep crossing. So he's a great guest. So thanks, Tom. So tell us about yourself and the company you work for.
Thank you, Linda. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. As Linda mentioned, my name's Tom Garrubba. I'm the Director of Third-Party Risk Management Services for Echelon Risk and Cyber. We are a risk and cybersecurity firm based in the U.S. I'm actually based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But we have a lot of global clients, and I am responsible for all things with respect to third-party risk management. Our various service lines, we have everything from OffSec and defensive sec, as well as advisory services and managed services that they tap into me when we have clients that have specific needs with respect to third-party risk, and they pull me in with respect to my background and experience. As Linda mentioned, we've known each other for many, many years. And I think the one thing that's exciting about people such as myself and Linda is we don't just talk the talk, we've walked the walk. We've done this. And this is one of the things we try to do is we like to evangelize and let people know there really is no one way of doing things. And I think we're going to be able to flush a little bit of that out here in today's conversation. You know, it really comes down to your organization. I've ran third-party risk management. I've actually created the program and ran it for a Fortune 4 healthcare company here in the United States many, many years ago. I was part of a standards organization called Shared Assessments. I was a subject matter expert on third-party risk, and I was also a co-CISO for the organization. And prior to that, I have a very extensive background in IT audit, IT security, compliance, and privacy. So a lot of the things that you get to see in the audit space really is something that's transferable to your third parties, because I've often said, and maybe someday on my gravestone this would be quoted, that third parties are simply
not too soon.
Not too soon. Yeah, please. Third parties are nothing more than an extension of your organization, and you need to treat them as such. And a lot of people are still struggling to understand that holistically within their organization. So I think, today we're going to be able to talk a little bit about that, as Linda mentioned, about future-proofing your programs. I really think that you're going to get a lot of insight from myself and from Linda today. So I want to thank you all for joining.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Tom. So we're third-party risk management, and we're all about certifications, workshops, training, remote and classroom, etc. And as Tom said, I do come from the sector, so I've been consulting in this area since 2008, exclusively consulting in third-party risk. But also prior to that, I was a chief procurement officer and head of third-party risk 4 times in 3 major banks. And I was the CEO of an e-marketplace company. So, yeah, I have actually, sort of been on the firing line too, Tom. So I do appreciate that. I got to tell you, I love this topic. I've written 2 books, and we have a certification program through Third Party Risk Institute and other training, but it's certified for 66 CPE credits, which is the largest one they've ever done through NASPA.
Nice. Linda, can I do a quick shameless plug? Quick shameless plug.
Yeah.
I also put out on a weekly basis on LinkedIn my TPRM tidbits, which are about 3 to 5 minute snippets on a topic of the day. And starting next week, I'm actually on a monthly basis, I'm going to put a small little LinkedIn article called TPRM Snackables. So you get the tidbit, which is the video, and the snackable, which just is an article talking about topic of the day or something that's come across my desk. And just wanted to share that for you. So, obviously, please.
That's not a shameless plug. You know what? That basically is what we're trying to do, is peer sharing. I mean, we post 3 times a week, and we have a YouTube channel, etc. In the long run, third-party risk management is still a relatively new risk discipline. That's why it's so important to network. So I also just want to make a note that we were welcoming people today from, let me just go through the list of countries, because I'm quite astounded. We have Indonesia, Puerto Rico, South Africa, Turkey, India, Saudi Arabia, the UK, Bangladesh, Barbados, Cambodia, obviously United States and Canada, and Kuwait, and let me see, I think, in South Africa. And did I say UAE? Lebanon? So anyhow, it's very international. So it just shows you how important this topic is to all of us. So anyhow, let's dive right into some of the material. So Tom and I obviously spent some time preparing for this. And so during our prep call, you were saying, Tom, that you thought that some organizations kind of misinterpret third-party risk management. But maybe you could explain, what do you mean by misinterpret, and what is the correct interpretation for third-party risk management?
Yeah, and this is something that Linda and I, folks, had a really good and in-depth conversation on. Third-party risk management, you could really look at it through 2 different lenses. The one lens we look at is your service network. And this is when your organization is actually offboarding data for processing. Okay, whether it's personally identifiable information, whether you're hiring somebody to come in and they're going to help you with a marketing strategy or a growth strategy, a mergers and acquisition, you're handing them data about that's confidential to yourself. That service network requires you to do proper due diligence with respect to security, with respect to availability, with respect to privacy. Kind of like the AIC, the availability, integrity, and confidentiality that you expect in typical security circles, now adding privacy to that. The other part of that is what we call your pure supply chain. This is when your organization, such as a manufacturer, is actually putting something to market, and you're relying off of other suppliers to provide you with resources, whether it's a service or whether it's an actual product, for you to make your final product. Now, in those 2 channels, when you're looking at your service network perspective, a lot of organizations are focused on security. They're focusing on privacy. What are they doing with my data? Am I comfortable with what they're handling with my data? In the pure supply chain side of the house, most of the focus is on availability and continuity. What happens if a supplier here happens to have maybe a labor issue, or what happens if there's a factory fire? How's that going to affect me? Am I still going to be able to get my product out to market and achieve my monthly or quarterly goals? So there's different focuses with respect to risk. Now, what I'm starting to go ahead.
Let me just hop in here, because I think this is, it's a language of risk that sometimes gets confusing. So I want to thank you for bringing that up, because supply chain basically is, as you said, Tom, it's about source of supply and availability typically, right? So that to me lives in the world of procurement as more than in the world of risk control specifically, whereas third-party risk basically has it's a complementary side of that, because the way that other organizations run their business, when they have access to your network, your systems, your customers, or you're dependent on them for operational resilience, etc., you need to understand how they run their business and examine their controls in order to determine whether or not you have a level of comfort with, in fact, working with them and giving them access or having this high degree of reliability. Right. So you've got these 2 things working together. And what I see a lot of times, Tom, is is the sort of failure to integrate the component pieces, right? Your procurement organization needs to be working hand in glove with your risk specialists. And you mentioned food production, for example.
Yeah.
And that's a good example where they have to also be working hand in glove with compliance, right? Because some organizations, it's data and compliance. Other ones, it's data and operational resilience. Like the types of risks that bubble to the top can get confusing because the language gets messed up. And I do want to make one more point around what is a third party, right? So we started out with vendor or supplier risk management, and then suddenly everybody's talking about third party risk. Well, why third party and not stick with vendors? And that's because there really are two types of relationships that need to be in scope or need to consider how to bring them in scope over time. The easiest one is obviously your vendor population, right? You're buying a good or a service and you're paying them through your accounts payable system. So whether you have messy data or not, they're still there and they're relatively easy to find. The other type of third party is, in fact, what I just call simply a non-vendor third party. So with that type of relationship, there's very often no money changing hands. So I come out of financial services. Think about correspondent banking. Think about the SWIFT network that handles payments, right? So they're not showing up in your vendor population and accounts payable, but your organization has an incredible reliance on them to perform some sort of an activity, usually a service, and you're not going to find them unless you go look into businesses, right? So when you start to put the pieces together, you've got this confusion around supply chain and risk management and controls, and then in the larger whole at the program level, some people really struggle to sort out what's a third party and what else counts. So a third party is any entity or person, whatever. You have a business relationship with them, but they're not as your customer, not as your employee, right? So everybody else, and that's why you get these enormous extended networks or extended enterprises. Yeah. So sorry, that was a long explanation, but yeah, I just wanted to clarify, Tom.
Yeah, Linda, let me see if I can even add a little bit of color commentary to that as well. I've always looked at it from a contractual perspective. So the first party is the outsourcer. They're the one who is going to be reaching out to the said vendor. So obviously that becomes the third party. Your downstreamers, your fourth party, your fifth party, however low you want to go. I call it the limbo effect. How low do you want to go? But the second party in many cases,
limbo effect. I'm sorry. We just need to pause there. I like that one. Say that again.
Sure. Well, I've always called this the limbo effect, because many people have reached out to me over the years and said, Tom, how far should I go in my due diligence?
Yeah.
Fourth party, fifth party, sixth party. So it's really how low do you want to go? And it's the limbo. Yeah. So I've often said, this is where you need to have the conversation with your chief risk officer, with the other business leads within the organization. Say, are you comfortable with me stopping at the third party? Oh, wait, what about our vendors? The vendor's vendor. Okay, the fourth party. I knew one organization, and I think you and I had this conversation, they went to the sixth layer. And they went to the sixth layer.
How to get to the sixth layer? I mean, that's like super hard. I mean, people are struggling to get to fourth. I mean, let me just put up my hand and say, you have to know who your material fourth parties are. Absolutely. So your material fourth parties, basically, they have characteristics like heavy operational reliance by your third party. They may have access to your systems indirectly. They may have access to your data, et cetera. You can set up characteristics to say, we care about these ones, so you're not silly about it. You need to know who they are, and you need to know whether or not your third parties have a good third party risk management program, because you expect them to behave in the same way you do. And quite frankly, if they haven't done that, then basically you're kind of in trouble, because you can't see through them to their third parties. You can't actually evaluate directly their third parties, your material fourth. So you need to really have a closer look at your third parties and how they're doing things. But how did they get to six, Tom? I mean, holy man, that's pretty deep.
Well, this was a large financial organization that did a lot of work for the U.S. federal government.
Okay, well, stop right there, because like most people are not in that boat, right? So, because I mean, I've had these conversations with people, unless you're a behemoth and you have like really huge negotiating power and some clout behind you, you are not getting in to see anything really in particular about the fourth parties, much less six. And why don't we move on to something more realistic, Tom? So, okay. So basically then the misinterpretation is really around the taxonomy. Like, what do we mean
Yes.
by, and what should we be doing? And quite truthfully, I find that a lot of people really struggle to think about sort of beyond the procurement type things they're doing, which I call procurement related due dil, to get into the risk controls evaluation. That's what you're doing in third party risk. You're looking at the other company and saying, you know, how are they doing things? Okay.
Right.
So we talked about cyber risk. I think we talked indirectly about business continuity. Can you talk a little about what other kinds of risks are that you consider important, Tom?
I think the most important risk out there, and I'll just cut right through it, it really comes down to reputation risk. All of these other risks somehow tie into financial, your operational risk, your locational risk, geopolitical risk, ESG risk, all of these risks. And I didn't even mention cyber yet. These are things outside of cyber. And this is what a lot of third-party risk management programs are starting to be tasked to take on. Third-party risk management is starting to be looked at as a one-stop shop. And this is where I have a lot of heartburn when I continue here in the US at least, continue to see third-party risk management programs housed in the information security or housed in IT, because third-party risk isn't just for cyber anymore. And as organizations grow and
if it
mature,
ever was, right? So yeah, I hear you.
Yeah. So, but those programs I'm starting to see, this is something I'm releasing later called third-party risk generations. You know, having an understanding of what generation are you, and without going into that, but it really comes down to reputation risk, because financial risk can be something that affects you for a shortened period, whether it's quarterly, and then your organization can make adjustments. If something happens to your organization or to a vendor, it's your name that's on the cover of the Wall Street Journal. Go back to Target. Okay. To this day, I'm lucky if I ask 10 people, 10 TPRM professionals, what was the name of the provider, the vendor that caused the Target breach? They can't name it. They can't. All they go, oh, it was an HVAC. Right. Happens to be Phasio Electric, which is right here in Pittsburgh, but that's another thing. And I say that because people don't really have a grasp on, like you mentioned, who these fourth-party and ancillary vendors are, or who these third parties are that are actually connected to your network. So you need to have a total understanding. Yes.
So I just want to interject basically, because we keep trying to future-proof. So what we heard so far basically is do a good job in your taxonomy, right? Make sure everybody understands the scope of the program and what you mean by certain things. We've also talked about some of the types of risks that you may want to evaluate. We've talked about material fourth parties. So if your program doesn't have a way to really understand who your material fourth parties are, it's time well spent. So what I would recommend is that you define the key characteristics of a material fourth party, maybe 5 or 6 things that say these are the ones we care about. And then you also work with your general counsel's office to actually define a material fourth party so you can put it in your contract. Because with your material fourth parties, in addition to your third parties, these are the ones that you should have in your inventory, in your third-party risk management system. If you don't have a system, you really need to do a better job of convincing executive management that it's a good investment, because you will spend a lot of time chasing tasks and not be able to spend much time on risk management. So why would we want to know that? So, for example, I've got it up on the screen here. So the SEC in the US, right, the Securities Exchange Commission, has recently come out with some new rules around cybersecurity and incident reporting. So they are basically saying if there's a breach that involves any material, anything that could materially infect an investor, then basically you need to notify if there's been a breach or something going wrong with your own organization, including its third parties, and you have to notify them within 4 days. So if it happened in your own organization, you could see it. Well, that's possible to notify within 4 days, even if you will be investigating sometimes for years, but you have to tell them something has happened, right? So it includes your vendors, but if your material fourth parties also have access to data and have a breach, then basically, if we're seeing this SEC requiring this, we're also going to start seeing this, and lawmakers and regulators around the world asking for the same thing. So if you're not able to even know who your third parties are, your critical third parties in your material fourth, you don't have a hope in heck of being able to comply with many, many regs including the note to basically the requirement to report. So there's a lot of good reasons for knowing why. So the second thing you talked about was reputation risk, which is really tricky, Tom, because it's a consequential risk. So what I mean by a consequential risk is it's the result of a risk event occurring and the impact on your organization. And you quite correctly said that in the long run, the company that is outsourcing or hiring a third party is ultimately accountable for all of the risk. And in fact, what we're seeing in some of the laws around the world is that they're being held directly accountable for your company's being held accountable for the recovery costs, for the fines, et cetera, even if it was a third party or fourth party breach. So they're trying to make it more and more expensive. I mean, look at the fines around GDPR.
Yeah.
Right. So I just want to cap there and say, what are we learning about future proofing? So, and then the last but not least is, how would you define what's critical and should be in your program, Tom?
Yeah, when you start talking about critical, it can be a combination of subjectivity and objectivity. When we talk about criticality, you can have a business unit that does a big chunk of revenue for the organization, but you can have a smaller component based on their reputation in a said industry that if something goes down, what is the criticality? Let me give you a great example. Back in the days of yore, when I was in audit, I was audited.
That was a while ago, right?
That was a very long time ago. Very long time ago. I don't think our country was founded then. Back in those days of yore, we had an organization within the bank that I was actually in the audit department, and they owned mutual funds, and they had a very, very reputable mutual fund organization. So I asked them, what was the most important feed that they had to provide, or what was the most critical transaction they had? And they actually defined this one transaction that goes to Wall Street and publishes the net asset value of all of their mutual fund results. And I basically said to them, well, what happens if that feed doesn't go through? And he just looked at me with a blank stare. Now, this is obviously a lot before
that's
a lot of people
being shell shocked, right? Because that is pretty serious, right? You have to
absolutely imagine
asset value end to day.
Imagine opening up the New York Times the next day, or your local paper, and you go to the business section and you want to see what your mutual fund is, and it just says dashes. And the first words out of his mouth is, think of what the reputational hit our mutual funds would take to that.
Yeah,
mind you, no dollars and cents.
Confidence.
It's not a fine. It's nothing that, but it's an absolute issue, that happened right there. So just something to think about. It's really dependent on the business unit. But when we're talking about what in terms of criticality, this is where you start having to look at through the data lens. I've always been a fan of looking through the eye of data. And this is where you start talking about criticality. You start looking at how many records. Is it 1 million records? Is it 10 million records? What are we talking about? The type of data. Is it company confidential data, or is it personally identifiable information? Is it credit card data? Is it health information? Particularly outside the US, there's value affixed to these various types of data. Just go check it in Europe, for instance. Just talk to any of your data protection authorities and they'll tell you this. Then you got to start taking a look at, where is my data being processed? Are you comfortable with the processing of what's, where it's being held at? You might have your processing being done in a part of the world that you're not comfortable with from a geopolitical, geolocational perspective. Where's my backup data? Where's my primary data?
That is a very good point, because basically, where is their backup site?
A lot of people
you could be violating laws. I mean, I think about healthcare, right? They're not allowed to process certain healthcare outside of their own borders. Right, there's lots of rules around processing, so it's not just the primary.
Yeah, don't forget contracts. A lot of people forget this, Linda, is, if you have a very large contract with a client and you read that contract, we used to call these oh my gosh, now I'm having a brain cramp. Anyway, these are organizations that said, you cannot process my data outside, in this case, US borders. You might have something that says, can't process my data outside of European borders or outside of an Asia Pacific market. If you do, I'm going to fine you $5 per record. Now, mind you, it's not a data breach.
But if you got millions and millions of records, right, it can add up pretty quick.
Yes, absolutely. So if you have a contract and you sit there and then you find out that, well, we have a data center in in Atlanta, Georgia, and our backup is in San Jose, California, and then you go sit there and say to yourself, okay, they're being processed there, and then you start looking into things. You start diving in deeper in your analysis, going, wait a minute, this is on a Unix platform, and their off hours is being done in Indonesia.
Well, you make a good point. Actually, that's something that I ran into when I was a CPO, Tom. It is basically, you really do have to have a good understanding. What we're seeing more and more is that, a lot of the big third parties, I mean, they have great control environments. They really do very strong controls, not a lot of problems, really, when in the grand scheme of the world. But basically, when you start to look at, well, where the heavy hitter security incidents are coming from is, in fact, typically now that the widespread ones are coming through, say, a software supply chain, right? So think about SolarWinds and Orion, which was one of the ones that really, it was the first of its kind. So like Target is going to be forever associated with that particular breach because it was the first of its kind. Also SolarWinds and Orion, it's pretty hard to shake that off. So what that was outsourced software development, where some malware was put into, this fourth party was put into the product itself, and then it was proliferated to tens and tens of thousands of companies and many government agencies, right? So basically understanding, and in fact, the U.S. has an executive order for their own agencies on understanding their software supply chain. So it's understanding, like if you look in the rearview mirror about SolarWinds, you would say, gosh, you should have asked some questions about the outsourced software development, because it would have been pretty obvious that it appeared to be being developed in Ukraine by a company owned by Russians, right? So that might have raised a couple of red flags for you to ask more questions, right? I mean, in the long run, I mean, some things can be okay, but if you don't know, then that's where the risk lies. Right. So when you kick it up a notch, basically kind of understanding not just your third parties and your fourth parties, but really understanding what they do and really what the risks are, whether it's could put in malware, are they a single point of failure, et cetera. That's why it's so important to understand what should be in scope for your third party program. And that's why I'm super hot on the whole concept of segmentation. Now, we have a couple of questions posted here. If you don't mind, I'm just going to read them.
Go right ahead,
First one is high speed. So from a taxonomy perspective, can you reflect on some non-vendor third parties? And for example, how do you generate a list, right? That's a tough one. So I do have some experience with this, so I'm happy to take it, but you first.
Well, first off, transparency is currency in third-party risk management.
That's a good
This
quote.
is where the onus goes on to the business unit as well, along with procurement and sourcing, and say, I need to know who's going to be exposed to my data. That includes your fourth parties, and saying to them, I need to know who's going to be touching my data. Are you okay with them? If you're not okay with them, you have the ability to go back to the vendor, the third party, and say, I'm not comfortable with this. You have to select another vendor. But here's the value you could bring to the organization by saying, look, I got a slew of vendors here in my vendor inventory that, I apologize, my cat's just decides to crash.
Well, can I just interject, Tom? Can you talk about the non-vendor population? Is that something you're comfortable with? Because I've done a lot of work in this area.
Sure,
go
ahead.
What about the ones that? Okay, so I come out of financial services, and so I actually have spent a lot of time actually helping develop lists of what this means. So through Risk Management Association, we came up with a list of 19 categories and 53 subcategories for a bank, for example, in non-vendors. So part of it is you just know how the business runs. So I think the first one that ever came to the regulator's attention was correspondent banking, right? So you have to rely on banks in other countries. But when we started looking at this, we started looking at how the business runs and the different businesses that different banks were in, and generating a list. So some of the things that are on the list, which would be for any industry, is a reseller, a payment processor. Do you buy and sell prepaid gift cards, for example? So I think that the way to look at the non-vendor population is very often there's no money, they're not showing up in accounts payable. So the first time I ever ran into this was I was a chief procurement officer, And I was really focused on vendors. Obviously, that's kind of what we were doing at the time. And I bumped into the loyalty program in the organization. So the way that worked basically was kind of like a revenue share, right? So it would never, it shows up on the balance sheet, that particular one, but it doesn't show up in accounts payable. And what we found at the time was there was this unbelievable contingent liability for points that were owed in exchange for products or services to clients. And so basically, I don't think that the executive was happy that I surfaced it, but there were a lot of risk issues with this because, of course, they had customer data. And so that's one example. So the question is basically like, how do you even find them? You have to know the business, right? And you have to go to every individual business unit. If they have good business continuity practices, they may be showing up as a core service and a core service provider, even if they're not on the vendor list. And these generally aren't, and most of the time they don't go through procurement. And so working with each business and coming up with a framework to say, this is what we're interested in, why, right? So points of failure, high reliability, relying on them to help you drive revenue. Do they have any customer contact, et cetera? Are they outsourcing customers for you and they have the data and you're passing it to you? So if you come up with maybe 10 characteristics, you have to go business unit by business unit to find them. So they do know who they're doing business with. They just never had a reason to tell you before. So anyhow, so that's how we came up with this list. And I remember when the OCC first came out with his third-party list or third-party label, a lot of people at the meeting were saying, well, this is totally different than vendor risk management. And I came in actually with this little spreadsheet and I said, okay, so let's look at basically, here's a list of things I came up with because I know the biz, right, that are not in your vendor population. And here's about 10 key characteristics or key types of risks. Let's go through them one by one and see if we can check off the boxes. And so I guess by the end of that meeting, all those naysayers said, oh yeah, maybe this is the same stuff, right? So you just have to get at them differently. Yeah. So that makes sense to you? Have you seen that before?
I have in some cases, a lot more that I have seen. It's more or less, you're starting to see, when you follow the 3 lines of defense model, a lot of that has been pushed onto the first line of business, saying you need to be able to define these relationships. We can't necessarily rely on the second line, such as procurement, such as third-party risk management or somebody else, or legal to have to find that out in the long run. So the onus is really on the business unit to identifying that as they're starting to go through the RFP. And I think the struggles that I'm still seeing today, and you and I had this conversation in the past, is reconciling the actual third-party risk vendor inventory to what's in procurement. And the reason why I think that's so important is particularly when you get to larger organizations, there's ways to bypass procurement and sourcing. You can have a business unit saying, okay, I need to notify procurement for capitalization purposes, anything that's going to be over a 50,000 spend. Mm-hmm. Well, if I find a vendor to do something for me for 25,000, I can fly under that procurement radar. And then what happens, procurement, corporate legal, they're not aware of it. So now when you're taking a look at your vendor inventory, only the business unit knows you're doing business with them. So that can cause problems.
Oh, does it ever? I work with an organization. Procurement was joking about the thought of taking on less than 50,000. Yeah. But, in the long run, understanding how to create a risk profile in a standard intake and then, blanket exemptions and whatnot, the efficiency of the model is really so important because sometimes the volumes are so big. Yeah. So, thanks for bringing that up. I mean, accounts payable data is messy. Spend is not the risk, right? It's often an indication of importance, but it's certainly not a risk unto itself. And so how do you get those in? And I always talk about, well, where's your on-ramp? Right? You need to be able to see these things. Yes. You need to be able to get them off the plate again out of the program if in fact they don't belong there. So what kind of characteristics of things do you not want to see? Right. So having a way to have them hit the intake and then bounce right back out again quickly, if in fact it's not in scope, is really important. Yep. Okay. I got another question here. So security requirements need to have a geolocation restriction, including hosting, storage, backup and current, access and support. This has to be discussed in detail, especially present day. So this geolocation restriction around these things, hosting, storage, and access and support, how would you recommend that organizations control that? Because you're trying to restrict it. And so thank you, Mark. You make a very good point.
From a geolocation perspective, you really need to have a corporate edict that says we will not be doing any processing. You basically need to come off with it and say these countries are off limits. This happened.
Yeah.
I'll share this with you because I think this is very important for those who attend on this call. I had a situation where the CISO gave me a call. He said, Tom, I'm going to send you a contract. Take a look at it. I said, okay, I have it in front of me. What am I looking through? He goes, do you see the word Shanghai in there? I said, no. He said, do you see the word China in there? I said, no. I'm like, well, Frank, what's going on? And he said, I just found out from a business unit that the vendor, because they were putting a freeze on upcoming spending, they took the work that was being done in Bangalore, India, and they moved it to Shanghai without our consent.
Huh.
He said, nothing is to be going to China. He said, that's a hardened rule. And I kind of said, Frank, I knew that, you know that, but do we share that information with the vendors? He said, no, but we will. And so what happened out of that was, and so look at it. Why did the vendor do it? Let's get to the root cause. The vendor made that decision because they knew they couldn't make any money on the front end because there was a freeze with respect to spending. So they said, oh, it's cheaper for me to process it in Shanghai than it is in Bangalore. So they're going to make money
right until you lose the business, it is cheaper, right?
But bingo. What happened there? We gave them 45 days to move it back to Bangalore where it was. And the CISO came out and said, you are not permitted to bid on any new scope of work for 2 years. Imagine being the partner on that engagement for your vendor and going, I really blew this one.
Yeah.
So that's what happened. So
yeah.
you need to, and we changed what was called our DPSA, our Data Privacy and Security Addendum, that actually said, first off, these are our requirements, our privacy requirements. These are our security requirements. By the way, I want it down to the shelf level in your data center, the location level of where it's going to be. And if you're even going to move it from one floor to the next, we need to sign off on it. It really got that draconian. But after that incident, it needed to be. Again, that was our risk tolerance. It's all based on your organization's risk tolerance.
Yeah. So your contract is really, really important. And I recently worked with a law firm, and I mean, it's pretty cheeky of me, but I went through their DPSA and their different ones and actually made suggestions on in certain conditions you may want to include. And I probably gave them about another, 50 or 60 ideas of things that they may want to occasionally put in those DPSAs, because you don't want to have something that's a book, right? That's not helpful. But sometimes there is a need, in fact, to add some special restrictions over and above your standard, data security agreement or whatever you're going to call it. Most organizations do have an addendum that they put to their contract. My suggestion is maybe have a look at that on a regular basis, about every 6 months, because the world keeps changing, and you learn forward, right? So being draconian, that's possible, but sometimes you end up with a book for a contract, and that's also not super helpful.
Well, I think that's also why it's very important. You mentioned the word addendum. DPSAs are data privacy and security addendum. You don't affix it to the actual contract, because at least on an annual basis, you need to be able to go and make those adjustments. You might have different remote requirements. And for those of you attending the session, Linda and I had a conversation, and I shared that the number one challenge that legal and third-party risk management had during the COVID was changing their data privacy and security addendums to allow their vendors to work in a remote setting, because everything else said you have to be on site, you have to do this, you have to do that. So to protect themselves, they had to go back in and reword it properly to make sure that they were permitted to do that during the COVID era. So
yeah, and basically hybrid work and work from home. We've learned a lot through the pandemic.
Oh, absolutely.
And so there's been great things that have come out of it, right? Some real improvements in terms of last mile and how we basically protect data, because sometimes you're not entirely sure where people are working from. Okay, I'm just watching the time and the questions. So we have another one, basically, how relative is quantified TPR? For example, everyone wants to know how to put a dollar figure on risk. So yeah, that actually is really interesting. So how do you put a dollar figure on the risk itself, Tom? I mean, that's a tough question.
that's so hard. I think the classic way of doing it, even though it seems a little bit elementary, is actually looking at annual reports that are put out by Ponemon or put out by Verizon puts one out, Deloitte puts one out that actually says, according to what our analysis is, it's typically $5 per record for personally identifiable information breach. 25, I've just heard this from my Inside House team with respect to health information. So if you're giving somebody 5-10 million records of health information, that's a ballpark on what you're looking at from a dollar and cents violation. And when we're talking not just violation, we're talking in terms of legal costs and everything else that's affixed to it. And that also ties into what's still termed the Wild West, which is cyber insurance and business insurance. And that's a whole different episode you can talk about.
That is true.
Yeah.
Okay,
but
so I just want to back up a little bit. So you mentioned Ponemon Institute. So I like that. I think it's a really good data source as well. So Ponemon Institute is commissioned by larger organizations to do studies around the world on the cost of a data breach. And I noticed, I think it was maybe 2 months ago, they did an update on that. So IBM sponsored it, and it was, I think it's called, so it's Ponemon, Ponemon, Ponemon Institute. And I think it's the IBM Security Cost of a Data Breach is the name of the report. It's got really good information, and it also, you mentioned healthcare records are more valuable than certain other records, right? So there's a premium placed on those. They tell you how much it might cost in the financial services sector. So I think if you can take that information and marry it up with, if you have a good view of the portfolio and the risks that you've taken on, and what are the residual risks, especially where there are, where you actually have given data over access to networks and systems, you could probably actually do a reasonable straw man estimate of the cost of a breach for your organization for sort of the larger portfolio, and also if you've assumed higher levels of risk in certain areas. Because every now and again, you don't want to because there's no other choices out there in the market. So yeah. Anyhow, so that's really great information. And what was the other one you mentioned, Tom? You said
Deloitte usually puts on an annual one, and then Verizon put out their annual data breach reports, and that's where they came up and said upwards of there was, I think it was 46% of their reported vendors had breached, not their, Verizon's, but in their study, 46%.
In the study, yes, in the study.
Yeah, but I'm seeing upwards now. What makes it tricky is 85 to 86% of organizations, some way, shape, or form, perform outsourcing of important data, confidential data, et cetera. So it affects everybody. And the big question mark, anytime you're talking about whether it's cyber insurance or any of this stuff with the cost of a breach, it's what is the cost of a class action lawsuit? And that
that's a good point too. Yeah,
you have no idea.
And if you're having trouble getting persuading your organization to invest in a third-party risk management system and risk intelligence solutions, I think you maybe could look to some of these data sources to say, okay, so it's pay me now or pay me later. Would you like to invest in prevention, or would you like to reinvest in recovery? Because that's what you're going to do. Okay, we've got another question here. Sorry, it's not a question, but a statement. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that, Mark. But yes, I wanted to turn it into a question because I thought you made a good point. So, sure. Okay, we had another question come in through our website, which is how do they put a ESG program in place in third party?
That's it really depends on the region that you're in. Yeah. And let me see if I can explain it this way. I was at a risk conference in London a few years ago, and a wonderful comment made by one of the chief risk officers from one of the large banks said, it's really based on geography. So in other words, if you are a European bank, when you take a look at the letters ESG, their emphasis is on the E. It's all about environmental. When you're here in the US, there's much more emphasis on the S, smaller E, big S, about the social, about diversity, about inclusion, things of that nature. And again, the small piece of the G. So it really depends on what you're in and what you need to do. There's a lot of guidelines that you can use. They come everything from the United Nations. There's other organizations out there. I know BlackRock was heavily involved with this, plus some other organizations. I don't know all of them off at the top of my head, but
You don't know
what?
everything? Come on, Tom. I'm sure you do.
If I did, I'd have a drink in my hand and not just water right now, Linda. But and I'd be on a nice warm island. But no, and I think what it is when you're going to be doing this, and this really gets back to, we don't operate, third-party risk management for far too long has operated in a bubble. You need to get outside that. This is where you need to have the conversations with your risk officers, with your legal counsel, and say, what is important from us, from an investor perspective, from a reputational perspective, on and on and on. Because when you start getting into ESG, that's where you're starting to hit your reputation risk. Okay. I've had business units that actually said to me, don't tell me I can't use this data be centered because they weren't certified green. Come on, this is what the cost is. Again, everybody has a different tolerance of risk. So, you can go in there and be Joan of Arc, or try to be, St. Thomas, trying to, preach about ESG and all that stuff. But if the organization comes back to you and goes, no, money's tight and times are hard, this is the way we're doing it, then you have to be able to take that into consideration. Know what battles are worth fighting. If ESG is something that your organization is taking on, guess what? It's upon you to be in that front row when you go and you're sitting in those meetings. Be a part of it. Be the value add to the organization. Don't be on the back end, because if you are in the back end, you are now putting yourself in a reactionary mode instead of placing yourself in a proactive seating. So that's, I think, is very important, making sure that you are with those decision makers on the ESG side.
Okay, so I'm going to wrap up there because we're almost at time. So what I'm seeing also on ESG is, first of all, Tom, you're quite right. What's important to your organization and what business are you in? So that will help determine what you're going to do. So the second thing that I would say is that I'm seeing a lot of responsibility falling on the procurement people during the sourcing and selection process for things like, environmental, et cetera, because they can actually do the searching on or they can do the investigation on the policies around diversity and inclusion or environmental controls. If in fact there are production activities where there are environmental controls, then you can evaluate the controls through your standard part of your third-party due diligence controls evaluation. But it's not an easy question to answer, and you have to start somewhere. So pick what's most important and then figure out, is it something I can determine through a procurement activity, or is there a control there that I can evaluate? So I'm going to leave it at that, Tom. We prepared a bunch of questions and things to talk about. I think we got the first two covered. So that's a good sign. We had lots of questions today.
Can always do a part two, Linda.
There's always a part two. Oh my gosh. The time goes so quickly. So I really appreciate it, Tom. I really valued the opportunity to have you here today. You're very knowledgeable. You've been in this field for such a long time. So I want to encourage you. So, Tom posts, you post every week, right? And you're about to post even more frequently. We do the same. So we've given you our LinkedIn, and we just want to thank you for being part of this today.